took our glorious 13-foot Scamper camper to Ouray, Colorado on its maiden voyage. And if you've never been there, Ouray is gorgeous. Mountains, hot springs, hiking trails, more mountains, 10 out of 10 would recommend.
Yes.
Also amazing about Ouray was the lack of phone or internet access. And here I'll give a backhanded shout out to T-Mobile. But in this case, poor reception was fabulous. I disconnected and it was really good for my soul. So this is why it was only on the drive back home on Saturday, June 25th, that I learned about the Supreme Court decision of June 24th reversing Roe v. Wade. I was born in January of 1969. My birth mother got pregnant second semester, freshman year at a Christian college in Florida, where she was majoring in English. One of the very few things I found out about her on the internet was a digitized yearbook from that year. While I know very little about the circumstances, I do know that like most middle class and lower middle class girls in her situation, she carried me to term and gave me up for adoption. She did so because she had no other practical choices, medically, socially, economically, or politically. And if you don't know why, I recommend you read The Girls Who Went Away, The Hidden History of Women Who Surrendered Children for Adoption in the Decades Before Roe v. Wade by Ann Vessler. I am not grateful for my birth. My birth mother's life changed dramatically for the worse because of her lack of choices. And I'm not speaking here only or even primarily about abortion access. Had she wished to keep me, she had neither the financial nor the social support that such a choice would have required. She lost her college scholarship, and because she attended a religious college, she was expelled. By all accounts, my birth father suffered no such consequences, and indeed, for her own reputation, or what was left of it, she never named him. Personally, I am ambivalent about abortion, but also, at age 54, and in the full flush of menopause, pun intended, the question for me is only academic. But what I'm not ambivalent about at all are the consequences of restrictions and the lack of access and support. As we made our way home from Colorado to Missouri, I cried for over an hour. And not just for my mother, but for the very lovely student I met my very first year as an undergraduate dean. She had been dismissed for academic reasons, and in her appeal, we learned that she had been sexually assaulted, became pregnant, carried her child to term, and gave up her beautiful baby boy for adoption, all in the space of the fall and spring semesters. From what I know of her, I don't think she would have wanted an abortion, but for reasons not at all dissimilar to my mother almost exactly 50 years earlier, she couldn't afford to keep her child either. There was the stigma, both of the assault itself and the expectation she felt as a first-generation college student. There was also the impossible finances, the lack of support services. My mother, the woman who raised me, died in the spring of 2016. While home in Connecticut to help with funeral arrangements, either by coincidence or by karma, choose which one you like, I learned that Ohio had opened up its birth records, and for $20 and a notarized letter, it was now possible for me to unseal the records. A year later, I sent in my request. A year after that, I wrote the only letter I've ever written to my birth mother. I wrote largely as an apology. I am embarrassed that it took me 40 years to understand the circumstances of my birth, that is, the circumstances of her life. Until I read the book, The Girls Who Went Away, I hadn't situated myself in the last wave of white adoption before Roe v. Wade. On the surface, I had been indifferent to the fact of my adoption, although as a teenager, I thought of it as a very unusual and therefore interesting thing about myself. But I was always irritated, too, by the question, have you ever looked for your real mother? Answer, no, because I knew who my real mom was. She was Judy, and my real father is Dad, Alan, the parents who raised me from age 4 months onward. Many, many years later, when I participated in an adoption panel organized as a part of a colleague's class on the history of adoption, a student asked me that question. Have you ever looked for your real mother? I finally heard myself say out loud, why would I look for someone who had rejected me? And I realized I did have more feelings about being adopted than I had ever let on. How participating on that panel led me to send $20 and a notarized letter to the Ohio Bureau of Vital Statistics 10 years later is a different story. But when I did write the letter, it was with the knowledge that a reply was not guaranteed. A friend who knew my story asked me how my feelings on the gradual opening of Missouri's adoption records begun in 2016. And I remember telling him that I thought it was complicated, that while over the years I had gained a greater understanding of adoptees who wanted access to their birth records, especially for medical reasons, I still felt for the women who had adopted out their children so many years ago in the belief that the record of that event had been sealed, their shameful history erased. At the end of the letter to my birth mother, I wrote, I am obviously curious about you, but at the same time, I understand why contact might be painful, or relevant, or even from another lifetime. If anything, with this letter, I hope you understand that I don't blame you, nor would I ever claim any right to do so. You will not be shocked, I think, to learn that I am a feminist and politically liberal, which makes me more embarrassed for my own lack of generosity, however unintentional, when thinking or not thinking about my adoption. My birth mother has never been back, but almost 3 years ago, however, in the early months of the pandemic, one of my uncles reached out to me. He had heard about the letter from another sister, an aunt I did not know I had, heard my birth mother had chosen not to respond, and wondered whether I wanted to hear some of the family history from him. From him, I learned that after my birth, my mother broke with her family and disappeared into the counterculture for over a decade. While she eventually connected again with her siblings and her mother, there was much about her life in that period that remained a mystery. My uncle only knows that the decade after my birth was a painful one for her. Thankfully, my student's story has a happier ending. She got caring counseling. She was able to return to college. She completed her degree. She got a good job and recently got an even better one. She has a connection to her adopted parents and gets to see her son, at least in pictures. But she doesn't have her son, and this remains a source of pain for her. This is why I cried as we drove further and further away from Colorado on Saturday, June 25th. Not only, or primarily, because of the choice that had been struck down by the court the day before, but by the choices that to this day remain so dependent on demographics, economic status, geography, politics, and cultural acceptance.